Welcome to XYPN Radio, where your host Alan Moore brings you into a community of fee-only financial planners who want to profitably and successfully serve Gen X and Gen Y clients. If you're ready to get the knowledge you need from leaders in your field, learn from forward-thinking advisors, and take action on your own goals, XYPN Radio is the show for you. Here's your host.
Hello and welcome to this episode of XYPN Radio. I'm your host, Alan Moore, and today I'm excited to have Mitch Anthony on the show. Mitch is a coach, speaker, trainer, and all-around communication guru that helps financial advisors better communicate with and therefore serve their clients. Mitch is a keynote presenter at this year's XYPN 17 conference in Dallas. If you haven't gotten your ticket yet, be sure to go to XYPN17.com to get signed up. Mitch sort of fell into financial planning, but he's made a major impact on the advisors he works with. You'll hear it throughout this interview, but he has a really cool perspective on how financial planners should be focused on their ROL instead of ROI, ROL being return on life. He walked me through how he trains advisors to build a discovery process to really understand their client's background and story, what's important to them, and what they really want out of their life. If you're like me, by the end of this episode, you'll be wishing he was your financial planner, which is mainly amusing because he's not actually a financial planner, just a very good communicator. This month's episodes are brought to you by Right Capital. Right Capital provides innovative financial planning software that digitizes and redefines the financial planning experience. Right Capital was ranked as the highest user-rated financial planning software in the 2017 annual software survey conducted by T3, Tech Hub, and Inside Information, and was recently added as part of XYPN's technology package, making it free for XYPN members. Sign up for a demo today at rightcapital.com and mention the XYPN Radio podcast to be eligible for 10% off retail pricing. You can find any of the additional resources that we mentioned during the episode at xyplanningnetwork.com/104. Also, be sure to go to xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP to join our private group just for XYPN Radio listeners. It's a community of advisors we've all been looking for that's there to provide support when we need it the most. Best of all, it's free. I encourage you to check it out. Again, that's xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP. Without further ado, here's my interview with Mitch Anthony. Hey, Mitch, welcome to the show, man. Thanks so much for being on.
Yeah, happy to be here, Alan. Looking forward to this summer as well.
Yeah, I'm excited. So for listeners that don't know, Mitch Anthony is going to be one of our keynote presenters at XYPN 17. So if you've never heard Mitch speak, the first time I heard you speak was I was in college, so that would have been 2009, I believe. I was just about to graduate into financial planning, and you were our student association keynote presenter at our spring banquet. I remember it was just when I was getting into financial planning, and it was just such a breath of fresh air in terms of sort of a different take on financial planning than what I had learned in CFP schools. So I'm very excited to have that content, bringing that content to the conference, but also here to the podcast and sort of talk through some of those things.
Yeah, that was cool that you brought that up. That was a fond memory for me, and it's a great school you went to, too.
Yeah, very impressive university and just program there that's been built out. And I was very fortunate. I consider myself very fortunate that I grew up in what I call real financial planning. And I shouldn't act like I came up with that term. I think Carl Richards is the one who started calling it that. You obviously have sort of pinned on the life planning terminology, which I want to talk a little bit about, because we're all sort of coming up with we're all coming up with a way of describing financial planning that doesn't include stockbrokers and insurance agents, because they call themselves financial planners. But I consider myself very lucky to have grown up in real financial planning, and UGA was a great program for that. And again, just seeing speakers like yourself, my first boss, Rick Kaler, really showed me what that is. And I don't know how I would have found that otherwise. But before we dig in too much, let's sort of take a step back. And have you ever been a financial advisor, or how did you get into this?
I have not been a financial advisor. I've been nothing but an observer of good ones and some that aren't. I've always had a concern about money conversations. And I don't know how far back you want to go on this, but it started for me when I was running a suicide prevention center. And this is 30 years ago during the farm crisis. And I don't know if any of your listeners would be old enough to remember this, but people were losing their farms the way people lost their houses 9 years ago, right? And generations of work went down the drain. And I started a suicide helpline in Iowa, where I grew up, and then expanded it. And guess what most of the conversations were about? A poorly informed financial decision. They'd been sold something. And they bought, they paid too much. They bought during a time of inflated land values. They bought equipment they didn't need. And then the thing was destined to pop, and it did. And a lot of these people were stringing up nooses in their barn after it happened. That's how I got interested in the money conversation. Kind of crazy, right?
So you just sort of went out on your own and started this suicide prevention line?
Yeah, I did. I just, I was fortunate when I was very young. I remember hearing a preacher, and he said, write these 7 words down, and you'll never lack for something significant to do with your life. And the 7 words he asked us to write down were find a need and meet that need. And he said, now, when you believe in what I just told you, what's going to happen is you're going to realize that your ears are tuned to certain signals, your eyes are tuned to certain sights, and your hearts are tuned to certain issues. And he said, if you keep your eyes and your ears and your heart open, you're going to see things that other people don't see and hear, and you're going to sense things, and you're going to want to fix things. Well, I've always been sort of a person that liked to tackle big problems. And when I started researching the suicide prevention issue, here we had a farmer every day in Iowa killing themselves. And there was no suicide prevention hotline, service, counseling service, nothing. It just didn't exist. So it took me about a year to organize the thing and get volunteers in place, get them trained, raise money, plug in 800-line phones. People could call toll free, arrange advertising on billboards, television, radio saying suicide's not the answer. Call this number. And the first day we opened, we had 9 farmers call.
Wow. So how was it funded? I mean, was it a nonprofit? Were you raising money?
Yeah, it was a nonprofit, and that's always a difficult thing, right? Because you're I hate to use the word competing, but you are competing for those heart dollars. And back then, an 800 number was an expensive proposition, and we were almost unplugged a number of times. It was a stressful thing, It sounds like a really bad joke, doesn't it, Alan? To have your 800 line unplugged while you're doing suicide prevention counseling, but. So I ran that for a number of years and then ended up speaking in schools to students and teachers for a number of years. I was the guy who came to the high school and they filled the gymnasium, gave me an hour with them, and I talked to them about life. Then I'm an accidental tourist in the financial services world. I was invited to speak at a financial advisor's banquet one time because their speaker from Atlanta turned up sick, and it happened to be in my city, and I went and spoke, and the whole world changed for me. I got a FedEx envelope from an investment company the next day saying, who are you and where did you come up with these ideas? And they flew me to their headquarters. They happened to have a wholesaler in the room the night I talked. It was the first talk I ever gave in front of a financial services client group. And next thing I knew, I was running all over the world talking to financial services groups.
So what was it about that talk? Like, can you remember the topic or sort of focus of that conversation?
Yeah, it's a great question, Alan. So the advice, well, you want to hear the funny backdrop on this story? My wife, I was out in the garden with my daughter the evening this happened. It was like late afternoon, and I'm teaching my daughter how to plant a flower and the miracle of putting a seed in the ground, seeing a flower come up. And my wife walks out with the telephone and says, "It's a broker." And I take the phone, and he introduces himself, and I said, "No, thanks, Jim. I'm busy." And I hang up. My wife looks at me like I just killed the cat. I'm like, "What?" She goes, It's an advisor who has 400 clients coming to a banquet tonight, and their speaker's sick, and they wanted you to talk, to fill in. I said, Deb, did it ever occur to you to say that instead of it's a broker?
It's a broker.
Talk about a bad turnover, right? And so, well, and here's a great irony of this story. This was the first week we had caller ID on our phone. It cost like $3.50 a month. This is the first week. So I push the button and there's the number and I call him back and I'm crawling on my hands and knees and I'm sorry. And, I thought you were doing a sales call and, all this kind of stuff. He said, "Dude, I need your help." I said, "Well, describe your audience." He said, "It's retired people and they're coming for a free chicken dinner and all this stuff." That's all his clients. And I said, "I got the perfect talk." I had a talk called "Don't Ever Grow Old." And it was really sort of the seedbed for my book, The New Retire Mentality. Right? How to live a good life at any age. And it later did become the book, The New Retirement Mentality. So that was the idea that caught the investment company's attention.
Very cool. And especially then, this is still new, I think, in financial planning now, much less, that long ago in financial services. This wasn't a conversation that we were having as advisors. It really was about, that guy's intention was, how do we get a bunch of people in a room together and sell them something? Totally different. It is amazing how far we've come. And sometimes I can be a little rough on the industry, but it is amazing how far we've come. We've made a lot of headway. We've got a lot of work to do, but we have made it a long way. So that sort of spawned then other speaking engagements and consulting engagements with financial planning, and it just sort of pulled you in and we haven't let you go.
Well, the first thing that I noted, I started observing what was going on in the industry. And that new retirement mentality idea was probably the third idea that I was able to hatch in the industry. But the first idea was I was watching people try to communicate the messages they were trying to communicate with clients. And I thought it was all kind of confusing to the clients, all this language of the left brain, the charts and the comparisons and the industry speak. Even when you try, Alan, it's hard to wash and scrub all that industry speak out of your conversations, right? And I would watch clients and I think, I don't think they understand what they're talking about. And I just sensed there was a communication issue. And I'm real big on sort of the right brain approach to communicating with people, using the story, the analogy, using words like, it's kind of like, or this reminds me of, or this is sort of like, and using the language. I define a metaphor as using the language of the known to explain the unknown. So you take some time to get to know the language of the client and then try to frame what it is that you do in that particular metaphorical language. And so I wrote a book called Story Selling. My original title for the book was The Intuitive Advisor. And I was just trying to help advisors figure out how to communicate better with clients and how to speak to the emotional part of the brain, right? And a big part of that is just helping clients tell their own story. Too often I think advisors are so in love with their own value proposition and what it is they do that they forget to really get to know the person they're serving, right? And so that was a big part of it is here's how you get your client's narrative and here's how you get their story, and then find out, is there a place where our two stories intersect? And, one of the things I love to talk about is the difference between a monologue and a dialogue. The monologos is the two Greek words mean one meaning. And dialogos, it means the merging of meanings. And in this industry, what I observed was that there was a lot of monologues going on. People just telling their story instead of getting the client's story first and seeing where we have something in common between our two stories.
It's such a good point. And communication can be so challenging. Just 2 weeks ago, we had a staff retreat. We kept talking about another organization's ED. They have a new ED and blah, blah, blah. And finally, our COO, who is not from the industry, he's just an operations guy, was like, guys, what does ED mean? Because where I come from, that's not something we would be talking about in a staff meeting. And I just busted out laughing. And I'm thinking, he thinks I'm talking about erectile dysfunction, and we're talking about an executive director. And it just made me laugh that we just get so caught up in our own jargon and our own world that we don't even think about what the other people in the room are hearing. And so we're following Elon Musk's recommendation to just eliminate acronyms because it makes people feel stupid. Whenever they don't know the acronym, they have to go look it up later and completely lose out. And that's even one step removed from, one is just being able to say words and using language that the other person understands. The next step is what you're talking about, which is how do we actually connect with someone really in a more emotional way, in a more tangible way, instead of just talking to them or talking at them.
You're hitting the nail on the head, and there's a little phrase that I like to throw out, and it's this. Are you trying to be interesting, or are you trying to be interested? And you can always tell the difference, can't you? It's like people that are just talking to impress you and pointing to all their plaques, and that doesn't impress anybody. What they're interested in is, do you really understand me? Do you get me? And do you get what matters to me? And once they have that sense that the planner they're working with gets them and gets what matters to them, then that battle's over, right? Now they're comfortable and we can get on with the business.
It's interesting. It's a great point because it's interesting in financial services that we always feel the need to prove ourselves. And I believe it's Carl Richards who one time said that, it's not, if you go to a doctor, can you imagine a doctor that tells you where they went to med school and all, how smart they are and how great they are? Like, no one does that. There's like this presumption of expertise. And yet in financial services, we have this sort of, we feel obligated to sell instead of just assuming, hey, we are an expert in what we're talking about. So let's hear what the client needs and connect with that instead.
I'm glad you brought that analogy up because that's really where I got my blueprint for what I teach. I live in Rochester, Minnesota, home of the Mayo Clinic, which I'm guessing most of the people on this listening to the podcast have heard of. And here's an interesting thing about the Mayo Clinic. And all my family has gone in there and had a surgery of some sort. And you'll meet with a team, right? Not all at once, but you'll meet with 3, 4, 5 different physicians or surgeons or specialists. And here's a funny thing about the meeting these physicians. The first thing they always ask about, like you said, they're not there telling you how great they are, is your medical history. They want to know your background. They want to know your lifestyle. They want to know what you've been through in the past. And that's something I've been teaching for years. The model of financial life planning that I designed is really based on that sort of blueprint that you always should start the conversation with the client's history. I found it amazing that you could meet with 5 doctors in one day on one case, and they'd all start with the same inquiry, your history. They wanted to know because that context, and that's what's important here. They wanted to understand the context for what they were dealing with. And what I noticed in financial services is that a lot of people were missing the context. They were so busy trying to sell the prospect or the client on how much they knew, how smart they were, that they were the Einstein of Wall Street or whatever, that they missed the opportunity to gain context for whose life is this, what really matters to these people, what are they going to do with the money when they get it. All these things are context, and a big part of the context that we often overpass is what experiences shaped this person in front of me. That's important to know.
It's absolutely true. And I think about my dad who he watched my great-grandfather purchase a whole life insurance policy back in the 50s or 60s, I guess. And it was going to be his retirement and his kids' and grandkids' retirement because that's what he bought. Or that's what he was sold by a door-to-door, permanent life insurance salesman. And that experience very much shaped my dad's opinion of financial services because he saw the horrible side of our industry and the part that we've almost eliminated, but still got some remnants of. But it's amazing how an experience like that didn't even happen to him. It happened to his grandfather. Just seeing that can shape so many financial decisions later on in life. And if you didn't understand that, if you start diving into, something about permanent life insurance, my dad's just going to shut down and be done. No questions asked. Very few advisors are going to take the time to really understand that. They're more, looking for trying to solve the problem as quickly as possible instead of really understanding where the problem came from.
Well, I love the point you just brought up. One of the questions I teach in gathering a person's financial history is, have you had any experiences with any other financial professionals, either good or bad, that would be worth your time to tell me about? And I want to tell you, a lot of planners have told me when they ask that question, they'll see their ears turn red, but the story comes out. And in your dad's case, it would have been the story of his dad. And what I tell planners is, look, there's a lot. Anybody who walks in your office, there's a really high chance that they're walking around with post-traumatic advisor syndrome.
I've never heard that before, but it's so true.
You'd better be careful. Like you just said, if you brought up whole life insurance and they had that story, it's like conversation just ended because you went square dancing in a minefield, and that was not a smart thing to do.
So true. Post-traumatic advisor syndrome. Isn't it just so sad that that's where our industry has come from? And again, we've made it a long way, but there's still a lot of that out there. So I guess just to give the conversation some shape here. So if you're working with an advisor that, for that introductory sort of prospective client meeting, do you have a structure that you train advisors on like, these are the 3 or 5 or 10 questions you need to ask? Or I guess talk me through how you train advisors to handle that first meeting.
That's a great question, Alan. So I teach the story side of this business, okay? And let me demarcate what I mean by that. So there's a story of numbers. That's sort of the fact finding, right? We're going to harvest the accounts and the amounts and the numbers and the returns and all that. That's the left brain side of the business, if I can just use the left brain, right brain metaphor here. I'm interested in the other side of that. It's not the story of numbers, but it's a number of stories that give context to those numbers. So what I often teach planners to say is, look, Mr. and Mrs. Prospect, before we're going to get into numbers, don't worry. Money always leads to numbers. But before we sit and talk about accounts and amounts, I think it's really important that I understand who you are, where you've been, where you're at, and where you're going. So would you mind if we just take some time and I ask you a few questions about yourself? Now, who's going to say no to that? Right? People want to tell their story. They want to be heard and they want to be understood. And then the structure that I share, that I teach for gathering that story is the biographical model. And that's, the prejudice here is that I'm a writer. So, if I was asked to write the Alan Moore story, I've got a structure for writing that story, and hopefully we can sell the rights to Disney, right, Alan, when we're done with this thing? The structure I'm going to use in assembling your story is going to be history, transitions, principles and philosophy, and goals. And I don't even like the word goals. I like to talk about possibilities instead of goals, and maybe we can touch on that later, why that is. Because I think goals sort of fence people in and make them feel like they're obligating themselves to something, whereas possibilities leaves the window wide open. I could do this, I could do that. But anyway, that's the order, right? Of that I would gather your story. I'd say, Alan, tell me the background story. Tell me where you grew up. Tell me what it was like growing up. Tell me what your parents did. Tell me where you went to school. Tell me about your first job. Tell me about the story of your career and how you've migrated around and how you got to believe in the things you believe in and what is it that you actually believe in and what's your present situation, what's going on right now, what are the big opportunities in front of you, what are the big challenges in front of you, and then let's talk about the possibilities in the future. Right? It's sort of like, we're going to make a movie of your life and I'm going to be the financial director, but I need to understand the storyline here. So the structure is history, transitions, principles, philosophy, and goals. And so here's what I found in financial services. Almost everyone, when I first started looking at this, and I've consulted with a lot of major companies in this industry, they do it backward. Well, actually saying they do it backward would be a compliment. They start at the end and never do get to the beginning.
Right. They say, what are your goals? When do you want to retire?
Yeah. What are your goals? To which 90% of the respondents give you a deer in the headlight look. And I say, what a great way to start a relationship. Ask somebody a question that makes them feel discombobulated, right? See, when I ask you, where are you from? Nobody gives me a deer in the headlight look. They know where they're from. What did your parents do? They know the answer. Where did you go to school? They know the answer. Tell me about your career path? They know the answer. Isn't that a better way to start a conversation?
And just to be clear, it's not about developing rapport. This is actually about learning from your client. I mean, to understand those things. I mean, I think about my own backstory is that I was homeschooled. Anytime I tell people that I was homeschooled for my entire life, they go, "Oh, I get it." Like, I now get why, so many personality traits or so many decisions sort of connects a lot of dots. Well, if you never took a second to take a step back and learn that backstory, you wouldn't know that. And it wouldn't make sense, or I would be making decisions or statements or whatnot that might not make sense. So I do just want to clarify for listeners, it's not just about, hey, this is how we're going to start the conversation off and develop it. It really is about, you need to know this if you want to do real financial planning for these clients.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that, because you know what? I'm not teaching how to relate to be a schmooze, right? You can always tell when people are doing that. This is about understanding the story of the person in front of you. This is about establishing the context into which you're going to begin planning. And so once I've got that backstory, now I need to move into transitions. And this is where I've spent a good part of my career developing resources and conversations. Transitions are so important, and I'll probably talk about this a little bit at the conference, but I've got a little economic law of life I teach, and it goes this way. It goes, money goes in motion when life goes in transition, right? It's the transition that causes the money to move. So, and I'll often ask the audience, name any transition. They'll say death, money moves. Marriage, money moves. Divorce, money moves, right? Every transition causes money to move. But most planners are focused on the money in motion as opposed to the transition that caused it to move. That's chasing the effect and not dealing with the cause. Does that make sense? So we want to have conversations with our clients about what are the big changes that you see on the horizon? What changes are happening right now for you? And what are the changes you see coming on the horizon? And are you financially prepared for those changes? And the phrase I teach is it's better to prepare than it is to repair. And if we don't spend time talking about things before they happen, then they're going to happen. And sometimes they're going to be irreparable.
And I'd be interested if you have seen this as well. I mean, when I was still working as an advisor, I think 100% of my clients came to me in the midst of a transition because no one woke up one morning like, you know what I want to do? Talk to a stranger about money. That sounds like a great afternoon. They had a need, they had a pain point. And usually I'm trying to think if I've ever worked with someone that wasn't in the middle of a transition when they showed up, having a baby, getting married, getting divorced, starting a business, something was happening. And so I always felt like I was in repair mode because the transition was already happening. And then we were trying to prepare for future transitions.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. And that just underscores what I've been trying to teach for the last 15 years. And that is it's our responsibility. It's almost like the Hippocratic Oath of financial planning. The first way we do no harm is to understand what could cause harm and to sit down with a client and do a survey of what they're going through right now. And, it amazes me that planners don't know that they have clients who are thinking of switching their careers. That's a big deal.
Yes, it is.
That's a big deal. And there's a lot of damage you can do in that switch, and you got to handle it carefully. And so, I've developed things on life transitions. I've developed a life transitions checklist, and I'm developing a tool right now called the Financial Lifeline. I'm just trying to make it easier for financial planners to know what transitions are happening now and are coming in the client's life, and give the client and the planner a page of their life to look at when they're doing their financial planning, a context from their life.
So after you go through life transition, you said the next one is principles. So I guess what does that conversation look like?
Well, that conversation is just, how have you built what you built, right? How have you gotten to where you are? What has been your focus, right? What do you believe in?
Do you have tools? Do you have tools to help sort of flesh that out? Because I feel like you can ask a client that, and it maybe wouldn't make a lot of sense. So I guess how do you go deeper with a client to really get to the core?
Well, you're very intuitive, Alan. That's one of those areas, principles, and philosophy that I don't really advocate for having a tool to get it. I advocate for getting their backstory and their present story. And if you do that well, their principles and philosophy are going to come out.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So it sort of comes out throughout that conversation.
That's exactly. How could I talk to you about your history and your present situation and your hopes for the future and not be able to adduce what your philosophy in life is and what really matters to you? It would mean I wasn't listening. I do have one tool, though, that sort of gets at financial philosophy directly. It's called a fiscalosophy profile, right? How did you arrive at the views and perspectives you have around money? So we'll bring up something like, say, this, you and your money and your children. Do you believe in giving your children every advantage, or do you think they should earn their own way in the world and see what people say? You can do it directly like that if you want. But by and large, I think you've got to be more intuitive in the process and listen to people and hear their story, and their philosophy of life will come out through their story.
Yeah, I love that, because when I worked with Rick Kaler, we used a few tools from different sources, so I couldn't even say where this one came from, but we had, and I think he actually was involved in the development of money scripts. And it was so interesting when you talk to folks, because especially college planning, this was always really fun. Whenever a client couple, one would say, like, I want to pay for my kids' college because I want them to have every opportunity. They should focus on school. And the other goes, heck no, I want our kid to earn their way and they need to pay for their own college. And it was always fun to try to meld those two and understand where are you coming from. And typically, each of them had a different background when it came to their college experience. And sometimes it was, I paid my own way and it was awful. Like, I'd rather, give my kid something better than that. Or sometimes it was, my parents paid, or I paid my own way and I think they should do it too. I assume that whenever you layer in a conversation with a client that's a couple, it just adds a whole other layer of complexity when you're trying to figure all this out, sort of meld it all together.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about right there. See, when you ask that question, what did they do? They told you their story. And then out of that story came their principles. You know, in my family, we have the Anthony Family Matching Grant College Fund. And what my kids knew and know is that for every dollar they earned in either a grant or a scholarship or by working, I was going to match it with a dollar of my own. I was going to reward incentive. And the why behind that is because my parents couldn't afford to help me. And my wife's parents couldn't afford to help her. So guess what? We had to work almost full time when we went to school. And I witnessed a lot of my classmates going through their freshman year on the Budweiser scholarship, and their parents were paying for it, right? The frothy educational experience. So, you know, the cool thing about what you just brought up there, see, you bring up something about, you know, what's your belief about what you should do for your kids, and then they're going to start telling you what happened to them. And that's what the planner wants to know, needs to know, has to know, the background story.
So then the fourth phase that you talked about was goals or possibilities. How do you get to the root, to the true core? Because you and I both know if you ask a client, what do you want to do? I mean, one, even if you understand their past, you still sort of get that like, I'll retire at 65 because that's when Social Security starts, right? Or, you know, it's like, no. What do you really want this life to be for you? And I guess they typically have never answered that question. They've never been asked that question before. So how do you frame that conversation to really get at and get the client to open up sort of their mind around those possibilities?
Yeah, well, first of all, this thing about goals, you know, it's such an awkward conversation, right? It's like, because it kind of pins people in a corner and they got to say something. They're going to sound like they're listless, you know, or they don't care, or they're lethargic, or they give you the cliche answer. I'm going to retire when I'm 65. You know, I had this, I don't know if you've ever had an experience like this, but years ago, I went to one of these goal seminars, you know, where you spend all day working on your life goals, and then you write them down I wrote them down on a legal pad, because the two rules, you know, the two commandments of reaching goals is, number one, write them down. Number two, keep them in front of you. Right, Alan? You've heard these, right? So I went to this seminar all day and I wrote 35 goals down, and then I lost the legal pad.
So you can never accomplish your goals.
Right. Well, according to the theory on goal setting that I was taught, I'm going to be a loser now because I lost my tablet. Well, 6 years, I lost my way. 6 years later, I'm moving and I find the tablet in my library drawer. And now I'm about to have a great experience. I'm reading my list of 35 goals. 6 years later, guess what? 17 of them, I looked at and said, what was I smoking when I wrote that down? That's stupid. Did I actually want that? And then the other 18 had already happened organically. So that was kind of a wake up to me, not to get too esoteric here, Alan, but I think goals, rather than goals, it's really understanding the essence of who you are and what matters to you and what's meaningful to you. That's the important thing to know, right? Who are you at the core? What really matters to you? What's meaningful to you? How do you strive to bring value in this world? That's more important than I'm going to create, you know, this list of things that I'm going to do and places I'm going to go. You know, it's like the bucket list. That's part of the nomenclature today now, right? You got to have a bucket list. Well, what happens when you check everything off the bucket list? Now all you have left to do is kick the bucket. Right? So I don't think it's just about having a list of things you want to do. I think it's about understanding what matters to you and what's meaningful to you.
Yeah, and I also feel like the bucket list mentality really brings out a list of shoulds instead of a list of wants. You get a lot of like, well, I should want to hike Mount Kilimanjaro, so I guess I'll put it on my list. And it's like, oh wait, I don't ever hike. Why would I put Kilimanjaro on the list? Or like, I should want to visit all 7 continents, or whatever it is. Like I feel like we should on ourselves a lot of times when we're doing goal setting, instead of, like I said, it's an interesting change of I guess perspective. Instead of saying, hey, you know, we're not going to talk about your goals. We're not going to talk about, you know, the list of things you think you want. What we really want to understand is what's important to you, and how do we keep you focused on those things as you go through life, and as, you know, your kids get older and you know, jobs change and all these things are moving for you. How do we stay focused on what really matters?
Yeah, you know, one question I do like to ask people is, if you already had all the money you ever wanted, what would you do? Right? Let's take money out of it and just say, okay, let's just assume you already have all the money you ever wanted. What would you go do? And for a lot of people, they just keep doing what they're doing because they've already figured out what's meaningful to them. And this kind of goes back to my definition of work that I introduced in the New Retirement Mentality. I define, for a lot of people, Alan, work is a 4-letter word. They don't like what they do. They can't wait to get out, right? Work was not designed to be something like that. And my definition of work is it's an engagement that brings value to others and meaning to you, right? Value to others and meaning to you, an engagement. Now, I notice I didn't say anything about money. That could be a volunteer engagement as well as a working engagement. But at the end of the day, you have to know you're bringing value somehow, and you have to have that sense that this is meaningful to me. And I have this conversation with, as you know, our industry is aging, right? And I have this conversation with a lot of planners who think, well, I guess I should retire. And I ask them, how meaningful are these conversations that you're having every day? And a lot of them say they're really meaningful. And I say, well, how are you going to fill that void in your life?
Yeah, because it's hard to go from, it's a very hard transition to go from being an advisor and working every day and having the conversations that we have to suddenly never having that conversation again.
Right. You gotta, if meaningful conversations mean something to you, then you're going to have to find a new place to plant yourself. So, my sort of theory, and I end up I'm kind of a de facto midlife crisis coach for friends I golf with, I think. I find that so many people reach this point where they're like, I just don't know if I can do this anymore. And I have this conversation with them called essence, environment, income. And our culture has it backwards. The beginning of the conversation is about the essence of who you are. Can you describe to me in 3 or 4 words who you are at the core? The second step in the conversation is, what environment can you flourish in? What field can you plant yourself in where your core, your essence comes to the fore and makes a difference? And then the third question is, how much money do I need to do this? Well, in our culture, that conversation is reversed. It starts with, how much money do I need to make? Then moves to environment. Where can I make that? And by the time you get to essence, it's like, oh, well.
Yeah, you can give up self as long as you can make the maximum amount of money.
Yeah, as long I'll give up who I am as long as I can succeed.
Planners tell me, especially because we work with so many new advisors, and really helping them to try to envision what is the firm that you're trying to build. Because we live in a very different world. And one of the things that I've tried to, I've started explaining to outside advisors when they look inside the XYPN network and they see, well, that advisor only makes $100,000. They're a failure, because they're not making $1 million. And what I find is that our group is very focused on building a practice that supports their life, that whole work to live, not live to work, and that the income expectations are different. And so often I hear advisors say, yeah, but I want to make $500,000. And I'm like, why? What are you going to do with all that money? And I'm like, well, I don't know. I'm like, well, do you need $500,000 or is $100,000 enough? Or is $200,000? I'm like, what is enough? And most financial planners have never answered that for themselves, which we really encourage folks to answer that question as they're building their business, especially as they're getting started, so that they know what are they building towards and why, instead of just getting caught in this rat race of growth. I have to grow. I have to make more money. I have to scale. I have to bring on more employees.
Yeah. The growth for the sake of growth, right? And I thanks for bringing that up, because it just drives me crazy. Like, what? Here's the overarching question that should drive every conversation in this industry. And the question is, what's the money for? At the end of the day, if you don't know what the money's for, no amount's going to make you happy. And ultimately, what the money's for is doing the things we love, spending time with the people we love, and going to the places we love. That's what it's for. And so it's to support who we are, where we are. And I often, I get so upset when I see commercials on TV with people carrying numbers through airports and stuff like that, right? It's like, I want to just shoot the projector at that point. It's like, please, I'm so sick of this. And I speak at 50, 60 conventions a year, and I'll go to these conventions where it's filled with, financial planners, financial advisors who are all about, people got to have more. And I tell them, on my way in here, I flew next to a guy who only had $500,000 in investable assets. And it was the weirdest thing. He was actually happy. I can't explain it.
I love it. And that's where I just got done reading Delivering Happiness from Tony Hsieh of Zappos. And one of the things at the very end of the book, he talks about that he has sort of this new obsession as he's writing this book about the science of happiness. And he doesn't claim to be an expert, but he just mentions a few things that he's learned through his research. And I'm honestly a little wary of going down this rabbit hole myself. But humans are actually incredibly bad at predicting what will make them happy. And the example he uses is, if you ask a room full of people who here wants to win the lottery and who will be happier if they win the lottery, every hand goes up. But we know statistically that lottery winners are no happier 12 months after they've won the lottery than they were before. More money does not make you happier. We know that, and yet we're so bad at predicting it. And I do wonder that I do think there's a lot of space in our industry to help our clients really get at the root of what will actually make them happy. And it, he touches on exactly what you're saying. Like, you have to be connected to something bigger than yourself. You have to feel like you're in control. And there's two others that I'm blanking on right now, but none of the four have anything to do with money. It's all about meeting basic needs and then really going sort of up the food chain in terms of needs and going after the more psychological areas. And it's not an area we learn about in financial planning, which is a shame, I think.
Well, one of the best things I think money can do for us is give us the freedom to do what we want with our time, right? But once you have enough money to do what you want with your time, why do you need more? Right? As long as you have the autonomy that money can deliver, then you've got it. But we live in a culture that is obsessed with more and doesn't understand the word enough. I had this conversation with a guy in New York City who was a really tremendous guy, and he ran private client wealth for a major firm in New York City. And he just decided to do his own little grassroots survey of private client people and ask them, how much would it take for you to feel comfortable? Right? Now, bear in mind, this is New York City. The people that had 10 million, because that was the minimum that the private client group worked with, said 25 million. The people that had 25 million said 50 million. The people with 50 million said 100 million. And the people with 100 million said, if I could get to 250, I think I'd be okay. And he said, at 250, he said that was the first group that said, I think I'm okay. Yeah, now bear in mind you're in New York City, okay? Your friends are going to the Hamptons on the weekend, all that kind of garbage. So, but anyway, that's how crazy this thought process is. At the end of the day, we have to understand money for what it is. And this is why I teach this thing called Return on Life that we're going to be talking about at the XY Planning Conference. And I like to juxtapose ROL versus ROI. Because ROI, the picture for ROI is just the hamster in the wheel chasing the dollar, right? Just going around and round and round because I need to get that dollar. The ROL picture that we share is of a sailboat where the sail is made of the dollar. I like that metaphor because money is nothing more than a utility that we skillfully manipulate in order to navigate, right? So the sailor has to have some skill with the ropes to properly work that sail in order to direct their ship where they want to go in life. And what I often say to people when they see that picture is, I want you to notice what the dollar's not. It's not the shore we're sailing toward. It's not the sea we sail upon. Neither is it the vessel which carries us. It's nothing more than a utility. But it requires skill, and this is where good planners come in. It requires skill to manage it properly.
Well, that's what I want to ask you. So first off, you mentioned these sort of four areas that you coach advisors on how to dig in with their clients. I mean, is this something that happens in a 1-hour meeting or a 2-hour discovery meeting, or is this something that's broken up into a multiple meeting sequence? I mean, it just seems like a lot to cover.
Yeah, it is. It's, if I was going to advise somebody, I'd say in the first meeting, you want to get their history. And obviously there's a little paperwork involved, and you also want to share your own story as a planner. Right? How you got here, what you do, why you do it. And then in the next meeting, we need to get a picture, a view of their present situation, their transitions, what's happening. Now, keep in mind, Alan, I understand there's numerical and mathematical work being done, so we can't dominate the conversation with one side of the ledger here. I'm talking about the story side of the ledger, okay? So in the second meeting with the client, we want to get to know their life picture. What's happening in your life? What changes do you see coming? And guess what? That drives future conversations, because once they lay out to you what's happening in their life and what's coming, now we have an organic, forward-looking conversation piece, right? So we never have to have that Groundhog Day discussion again, where it seems like we're talking about the same stuff over and over with clients. Where every time we meet, we're 6 months closer, or we're 1 year closer to an event they've already circled on the page and said, this is coming, this is happening, I need to get ready.
It sort of infuses the conversation, but sort of a bit of a structure for listeners is that first meeting is really about understanding their story. And I think it's interesting that you say share your story as well. And I'm not sure that we do that. I think we try to talk about how smart we are, and whenever we talk about how smart we are, what we're implicitly saying is how dumb the prospective client is. Look at these complex charts and how smart I am and how dumb you are. So you need to hire me to explain this to you.
Yeah, it's a really poor value proposition, because I don't know anybody that wins by making people feel stupid. Why don't we just open up with, hi, I'm going to use some really big words and terms you don't understand to convince you that you need to hire me at this rate. It's like, it's kind of like when I call my IT guy and he uses all this nomenclature that he knows I don't understand. And I know the reason he's doing it is because that way he can charge me $200 an hour, right? If he just said in plain English, plug it into the outlet, then that conversation would be over, So
hit the power button.
Yeah, we're kind of like you told me before this call, turn up your volume button, and Alan, you saved me $200 today. But what people want to know, they really want to know that they're understood, right? And so as planners, your value proposition, I have a little exercise for planners too to tell their story. And it starts with a metaphor. What I do is kind of like, right? If you start your description of yourself with an analogy that's near and dear you, you're not going to sound like anybody else, and I don't know that you'll disagree with me on this, Alan. I think a lot of planners sound alike today.
Oh, absolutely. Completely undifferentiated.
Yeah, well, as a matter of fact, I can tell you, I just talked to a major firm out there that I'm sure everyone would be familiar with, and they did a survey of 985 financial planners and their websites and the language they were using to describe what they did. And the person that ran this is a major project. And the person that ran this project told me that every one of them, to a man and to a woman, thought they were completely unique in the way they described themselves. And he said they all use the same language. And so, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I remember this phenomenon that swept the industry about creating an elevator speech. You remember that one? Right? And my joke was the reason they call it an elevator speech is because it sounds like elevator music. I mean, how think about this. How unique can you sound when you're working off a lexicon of 25 words? Everyone's using the same 25 words. There's no way to make yourself sound unique using the same 25 words. So this is why here's my prescription. If you want to sound unique, start with this. What I do is kind of like. And it's amazing as I watch people go through this process, the descriptions they come up of themselves, right? And then the second question is, the people I most enjoy working with are, and start describing your ideal client. And then the third question is that I like to get people to answer, planners to answer, is I try to bring value by doing this. So this is who I am in an analogy. This is who I love to work with. And this is how I try to bring value. Now you're not going to sound like everybody else.
So let me ask you this. I was actually talking to an advisor recently who had been exploring some different sales training programs and had been reading some various books. And he said, Alan, it just feels disingenuous. I'm not a counselor. I'm an engineer. I'm numbers oriented. Like I understand the value of everything that we're talking about today, but I don't know how to do it and I don't know how to learn. Can all advisors learn how to do this, or is this reserved for those that already have a right brain, that's and have a high emotional IQ?
No. So look, it's really helpful. First of all, I'm not a fan of sales techniques. I can't stand them. Drive me crazy, right? At the end of the day, if you care about people, and you actually want to bring value to their life, you're going to find all kinds of clients. You don't need tricks of the trade. And yeah, if you have a high EQ, emotional intelligence, this might come easier too. But here's the problem. Our educational system doesn't train the right side of our brain. It doesn't train us in these relational skills and communication skills. And it trains us more on the sciences, right? So, but people can be taught. People can learn these things. I'm convinced of that. You can learn to describe who you are and what you do in a way that's genuine and authentic and original to you. And what's important is just finding resonance to describe in sincere terminology who you are, why you're. Matter of fact, here's something that a lot of planners miss. Why don't you tell people your story in this business and how you migrated from this to this to this, and why what you're doing today feels so great to you? Right? You shared some of that story before we got started, Alan, right? About your migration through. That story really resonates with clients. They don't want to just know what you do. They want to know why you do it. And that conviction of how you arrived at where you are today in this profession, that's a powerful story, and that resonates with people. So you just can't be afraid to tell it.
So you would tell that advisor, yes, you can learn this. One of the things he also asked was, he said I'm going to mispronounce his last name. Bill, is it Bachman's value-based Bachman?
Backrack.
There you go. Thank you. He said, and I've never been through his program, but he said he had used some of those techniques or things that he recommended in a few prospective client meetings, and like 3 meetings in a row were just like, what are you doing? And it was really uncomfortable, and they didn't ever call him back. And so he was just like, screw this, I'm done. So how do you practice this stuff? Because I'm sure there's great tenets in all of these various educational programs. How do you practice without risking a prospective client relationship, or do you just have to give it a shot in a client meeting and see how it goes?
Well, I don't want to be in a position to critique anyone else's proposed techniques, but I'll just say this. The questions we ask need to be organic in nature. And what I mean by that is they have to be natural questions, right? It's like, Alan, if I say to you, now, once you left Georgia Tech, how did you get started? See, that's a natural, organic question, isn't it? Right? And we have to be careful that we don't get into esoterica and these questions where people are looking at you like, why are you, the financial planner, asking me this? It doesn't feel right to people. And so it has to be tied to what you do. And so here's something I teach. Before you ask anything, before you administer a profile or ask any question, tell the person, the client or the prospect, why you're asking before you ask. And I'll tell you why I prescribe that. Because the thing I've learned about the right side of the brain, the first question the right side of the brain asks as soon as you start talking is, why are you talking to me about this? What is the context for this? And if you don't establish the context quickly, the right side of my brain, the engaging side of my brain, the relational side of my brain checks out of the conversation. So what I teach planners to do is before you ask a question, tell them why you're going to be asking the question you're going to ask. Then the client gives you permission to ask, and now you're not going to have that awkwardness anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's what's hard about it is, and I understand when you're going through trainings in various educational programs, whenever you're training that many people at once, you sort of have to say, okay, here's the 3 things to ask or whatnot. And you're given the questions, but it can be really hard if it's not an authentic question that's coming from you. And honestly, this may sound stupid, but like you need to genuinely be interested in the answer. You can't just ask 3 questions and move on. Like you actually have to care, because we've all been asked the questions and you're like, you don't care about the answer one bit. I was at my fiance and I have a wine bar here in Bozeman that we love to go to. And one of the ladies the other day asked us, said, okay, well, what do you do? And I don't have a good answer that, because I don't really like talking to people that I don't know. And so I just say like, I do business consulting for financial planners. And say, oh, well, in what way do you do that? And I mean, she just kept asking question after question. She was so interested, and it was just such a relief, honestly. And it was just like, oh man, this is somebody who's asking a question that actually wants to hear my answer, and explained it and had a great dialogue and that sort of thing. And it just reminded me of the difference whenever you care about what the answer is versus just asking the question, to try to get the business.
That's an interesting thing you bring up. Years ago, I ran into this, and I actually, this forced me to write a book called Your Client's Story when I had this experience. I used to consult with a company that did financial planning for school teachers around the country. And they would have, like all these firms do, their President's Club meeting in San Juan, Puerto Rico or whatever, right, where the top 100 would come. So they had me come 2 years in a row. This is back in the day when you only had to have a meeting for half a day and then you go golf and somebody'd pay for it all, I'm at this banquet 2 years in a row. The same person, John Sigmund, was the number one guy out of probably 1,500 planners in their entire organization. And I turned to the president of the company and I said, wow, that's pretty impressive. He's the top guy 2 years in a row. He said, no, that's not really impressive. He said, try 11 years in a row. And I thought, what? What are the odds of somebody being the number one person out of 1,500 11 years in a row, right? So I went to this guy after the meeting. I said, John, could I have dinner with you? I'd like to pick your brain a little bit. And he said, yeah, I'd be happy to have dinner. So we agreed to have dinner the next night. And I said, well, before you come to dinner, I'm going to give you a question. I need you to bring an answer. And he said, what's the question? I said, the question is, describe why you've been successful in one word. Two will not be allowed. I just need one word. He comes to dinner, and it was really interesting what he said to me. He said, Mitch, it took me all of 45 seconds, but he said, I can't thank you enough for asking. No one had ever forced me to think through to it. And he said, I think I know the answer. And what was ironic about his one word, Alan, was that, you're not going to find it in the Tony Robbins Midnight Motivational Special, right? It's not there. It's none of the cliches that you and I would think of. It's the thing you just brought up, and his word was curiosity. He said something else dawned on me. He said, when I meet with people, I just have to know. Where are you from, and what was it like growing up there, and what'd your folks do, and where'd you meet your significant other, and tell me about your kids. And he said, and if they got grandkids, this is a long story, right? But he said, I have to know, because he says, I just don't feel right helping them with their money until I really, really understand who I'm dealing with. That's what drove him, right? And he said, something else struck me after I started thinking about this. He said, I've never once in my career asked for a referral, but people knock on my door all the time saying, hey, Mary told me I should come see you. My neighbor Ted told me I should. He said, I've never asked for one referral. So you just hit the nail on the head there. That's what it is. It's genuine. It's just genuine curiosity, really wanting to know. And there's something ironic here too, Alan. I've noticed this about people that aren't genuinely curious. They think everyone's alike. They think they're predictable. It's because they've never taken the time to dig under the surface to find out what makes that person unique. I come from the point of view, everyone is unique. There's never going to be anyone like them. There's never been anyone like them. I want to discover what that is.
So how can advisors learn more about this? Obviously, come to XYPN 17. I'll put in a plug there. Mitch will be our closing keynote. We are closing keynote on the last afternoon, which means everyone will be staying. They can't leave early. But do you do like group coaching, or do you have webinar series, or I know you've mentioned a couple of books. So I guess maybe like what, if we have to recommend two books that you've written, because you've written a host of them, and I guess any coaching series, like what would that be for listeners to learn more about sort of all these various concepts that we're talking about today?
Well, I do some work on retirement coaching that I'm sure some people are familiar with. Offer series a couple times a year, and we're getting ready to launch a coaching program on a return on life practice, how to build a practice around the return on life value proposition. Return on life is defined as getting the best life you can with the money you have, no matter how much money you have. All right. So we're going to build a model, and we're going to be coaching around that. The books I would recommend probably are Your Clients for Life, Your Client's Story, and The New Retire Mentality, which is written for clients to help them realize that this retirement decision is not just an economic decision. It's a life decision, and they need to really think through it. So thanks for letting me put a plug in for those things. And I got to tell you, I'm super excited.
Yeah, I am too. And people are always asking me, we know where to go get technical education, right? It's got a bunch of letters behind it. And you can go get the CFP, which is a must have. You got to know what you're doing. You can go get the CFA or CPA or, CIMA. There's lots of technical designations out there. But the personal side, the right brain side is so much harder to learn. And I don't know if it's because those folks that are attracted to financial planning aren't necessarily attracted to learning about the right brain stuff. But I do find that once advisors go down this rabbit hole, it's a never-ending journey of learning how to have these conversations and continuously improving, because this isn't like this isn't the technical side of financial planning where there's always a right answer. My dad always used to say the beautiful thing of math is there's one right answer, which is true until calculus, I learned. On this side of things, there's no right answer. This is really a conversation and a journey that you as the advisor take your clients on. And you're never a master at this, I don't feel like.
Well, we're in the business of helping human beings. And my goal, my mission, my objective is to make this process more human. And, you have to decide, am I in the people business and I happen to work with money, or am I in the money business and I happen to work with people? And I think the wise answer is to realize I happen to work with money, but I'm in the people business. And so that means there's a lot I need to learn about people. People are interesting creatures. And like you said, it's a never ending search for how do I understand this person I'm dealing with right now.
Yeah, the human brain is so interesting and complex. And the truth is, we are wired so poorly, especially around money. We are not wired to make good financial decisions and to be able to communicate about our goals and things like that. Just not the way we're wired. And to understand that the right answer is not always the best answer is a very hard lesson. And I think, folks, especially if you've run a business, anytime you're working with customers or clients, you see this where you say something and it's just misunderstood or it just doesn't make sense to them because you wanted to a la carte it instead of making it a package deal or whatnot. Like all the psychology that goes into those decisions is fascinating. And it's not always this is the best thing. Sometimes it's just this is the one that they really want. So anyway, it really is a fascinating discovery to try to understand humans. And again, a never-ending journey, but I think necessary if you want to do real financial planning.
Yeah, and one of the great myths around discovery is that it's done ahead of time. Discovery is an ongoing process. And, one of my favorite phrases is, if you want to make God laugh, show him your 5-year plan. For us to think that we can do one discovery meeting for 1 hour and we know everything we need to know about this client is absolutely absurd. It's an ongoing process. Why? Because life changes and people change too. So we need to keep that mindset that discovery is an ongoing part of our process in financial planning.
Well, Mitch, thank you so very much for taking the time to come on the show today and share some of your wisdom and expertise. And again, I'm looking forward to XYPN 17 and look forward to learning more and seeing more of the coaching program that's coming out.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alan.
A big shout out to this month's sponsor, Right Capital. Sign up for a demo of Right Capital's innovative financial planning software at rightcapital.com and mention the XYPN Radio podcast to be eligible for 10% off retail pricing. Be sure to join our VIP community at xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP to hang out with other XYPN Radio listeners, ask questions for future mailbag episodes with myself and Kitsis, and to finally find a community of like-minded financial advisors. Thanks so much for joining me today. We'll see you next time.
You're not alone, and you're not crazy. It's scary starting, building, and growing your own financial planning firm. And that's why we put together a free private community just for you, the Cutting Edge Financial Planner. Go to xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP or text XYPN Radio to 33344 and join a network of thousands ready to change the lives of Gen X and Gen Y clients.